consumer spending at restaurants went down like 30%. So then there's a trade-off.
You're worried about consumer spending. 600 people were murdered in Chicago last year. 2,000 people were shot in Chicago.
Hey guys, I'm Mike, and in this video we're looking at a CNN panel featuring progressive host Adam Mockler on Abby Phillip's show. The discussion centers on ICE, federal authority, and the controversy around federal troops being sent into Chicago during the Trump administration. Adam Mockler goes head-to-head with MAGA-aligned voices in a tense roundtable that raises broader questions about democracy, federal power, and political accountability. Before we jump in, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always great to see people from all around the world sharing perspectives here. I'll share my thoughts along. Let's watch the clip together.
Tonight, Donald Trump faces the most significant legal setback of his second term so far. In a major decision today, the Supreme Court has blocked the administration from deploying National Guard troops to Chicago to protect ICE agents. In its order, the majority wrote, at this preliminary stage, the government has failed to identify a source of authority that would allow the military to execute the laws in Illinois. The president has not invoked a statute that provides an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. In other words, no insurrection act.
Yeah.
No insurrection act here, so you can't put the military on the ground.
So this is a major setback to the president's effort to deploy the National Guard around the country. The law that Donald Trump used to send the National Guard into Illinois said that the president can call up the National Guard if he's unable with regular forces to execute federal laws. Now, oddly, both parties originally agreed that regular forces mean the cops, FBI, DEA, ICE, that kind of thing. The Supreme Court, though, then on its own said, well, could regular forces mean something different? Could it mean the military? And the challengers then said, yeah, that's what we mean. And today the Supreme Court said, yes, that statute only means if the military is unable to execute the federal laws. Only then can you send in the National Guard. And by the way, there's almost nothing the military can do in terms of executing the law. So bottom line, this decision leaves a very, very narrow lane to send out the National Guard. Only if it's something that the military is allowed to do, which is very narrow, and only if the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines is incapable of doing it and needs more help from the National Guard. So forget about Illinois, forget about Portland, forget about New York. Now, if there's a Republican governor and they want to ask for it, that's fine. That can still happen. But involuntarily, where the governor doesn't want it, Trump's going to have a real problem sending the National Guard.
Today's segment should be called Legal Things That Make You Go, because that is also a highly unusual thing for the Supreme Court to do, right? First of all, they ruled on an issue that was not actually litigated in the lower court. That's an oddball thing to begin with.
Alito does not like that.
Alito does, shockingly. Alito came out and said, guys, WTF with this. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And secondarily, the notion that they actually said the quiet part out loud, well, you can't send a National Guard, but Mr. President, you can send in the Marines. That's really, really curious.
But there's a big but to that, which is there's very little the Marines can do.
Just ask a Marine; they'll tell you that for sure.
One quick, insertion here for the other folks at the panel. The talk of the Supreme Court has been they're just giving Donald Trump whatever he wants. This ruling seems to suggest that, at least on some things, they are not.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Maybe there is something called the rule of law. Congratulations for Chicago. And Illinois pushing back. As a veteran, I said here and many other places that the National Guard had no business on the ground with civilians. And we see that with the recent death of the young lady in D.C.
The guardswoman.
The guardswoman in D.C. This was never something that needed to happen. This was all about, creating political conversation around it. Yes, there needs to be something done with crime, Joe, because I know you're going there next. I know the talking point, because you guys always say, what about Chicago? You're kind of predictable with it.
You nailed what I was going to say.
Yeah, so, yes, there needs to be something done with crime. But this was just not the way. It was unnecessary. It was not any type of long-term stability on actually reducing crime by investing the resources that the mayor hasn't been doing in Chicago. So I'm pleased to see.
But also the ICE bit of it, ICE agents coming into a city, it causes uproar and protest. And protest, by the way, not illegal in this country. The Trump's response to that is that we want to bring in the troops. And I think that is the other part of this that is part of the conversation, is that the Supreme Court seems to be saying that's not enough to just send in troops just because there are protests against the federal officials enforcing the
protests aren't illegal, but violent protests are.
Sure,
but
I mean,
ICE has always been in cities.
But let's be honest that the degree of violence is something that I think it matters, right? Like throwing a few rocks is not the same thing as a violent protest that would result in the military showing up on the ground.
Anyone throw rocks at our officers.
Nobody,
none of
nobody
the
wants
Chicago officials,
rocks
by the way,
being thrown. But can it be handled?
None of the Chicago officials, after they did a victory lap with the Supreme Court win today, none of them explained to us how they would actually guarantee the safety of ICE officers doing their lawful duties and making arrests and deporting people. Right? That is a lawful duty that ICE is doing. No one is debating that in the Supreme Court case. Why isn't more of a priority for the Chicago Police Department and Chicago authorities to protect ICE officers who are being victimized, who are being violent?
What you're hearing here is a familiar argument that regularly shows up on Abby Phillip's panel whenever immigration or ICE comes up. Figures aligned with the MAGA movement often claim that ICE agents are under constant siege from violent protesters and that extraordinary measures are needed to keep order. The problem is that this narrative doesn't really match what's happening on the ground. There is no evidence of widespread, coordinated, violent protests across these cities. What we've actually seen, in several cases, is tension created by ICE operations themselves, tension that local communities and even local law enforcement then have to manage. In fact, there have been public statements from police officials, including in places like Milwaukee, expressing frustration that ICE activity is creating additional strain for city police departments rather than helping public safety. There have also been documented incidents where police officers were caught in the middle of ICE crowd control tactics, including officers being accidentally pepper sprayed during enforcement actions. That's important context because it undercuts the idea that local law enforcement is uniformly aligned with these operations or feels protected by them. Abby Phillip makes a key point here by emphasizing that peaceful protest, is a protected right in the United States. Demonstrations, even disruptive ones, are not inherently violent, and treating all protest as criminal only escalates tensions further. Yet in MAGA rhetoric, protest itself is often framed as illegitimate, regardless of whether it's lawful or nonviolent. The concern critics raise is that sending ICE into these cities is not just about enforcement, but about provocation. The fear is that officials are knowingly creating flashpoints, hoping unrest will follow, which then becomes justification for harsher crackdowns and expanded federal authority. That's the backdrop for this exchange, and it's why the pushback from Adam Mockler matters here. With that context in mind, let's continue with Joe Belli and Adam Mockler and see how this debate unfolds.
Hold on, okay? The hit by cars allegation is also highly questionable, okay? The case that you're even talking about, they didn't even charge the woman who they accused of ramming into them. They didn't charge her.
You're not going to tell me that there hasn't been attacks on ICE officers,
but hold on
right?
a second.
We're not going to pretend like
While this ruling has been stayed, ICE has continued to operate.
Because that's
not just in Chicago, but in Charlotte, all across the country. So it does not seem that any of this has stopped them from doing their jobs. They're doing it.
It has made it more dangerous, right? The goal of this particular part of the National Guard deployment was to protect officers who were under siege, right? These are officers who always operated, by the way, even during the Biden administration, they operated in cities. But now that Trump's the president, now that they're enforcing the laws, suddenly they're under attack by these so-called nonviolent protesters.
I live in Chicago, and I've been to the protests at the Broadview Detention Center. The use of force from Trump was disproportionate. End of story. Like, it was just incredibly disproportionate. And when you poll people in Chicago, the majority of them say they do not want the National Guard. They do not want troops mobilized. Now, people will say that this lowered crime, but yeah, when you mobilize the military into the streets, of course crime is going to be lowered. When you look at D.C., consumer spending at restaurants went down like 30%. So then there's a trade-off.
You're worried about consumer spending. 600 people were murdered in Chicago last year. 2,000 people were shot in Chicago. You're worried about consumer spending. 25,000 victims of violent crimes in Chicago.
That's not what the National Guard was supposed to be doing.
The National Guard, well, Trump did deploy National Guard in other cities for public safety.
Chicago back in 2021.
Did you protest against the 2,000 people who were shot? Did you
awful.
protest
Of course
about
that's awful.
So
but
why
Chicago,
did you do a protest
Let me
for that?
finish. Chicago
why
back
are you
in
more
20
concerned about the
Hold on,
consumer public safety, consumer spending, rather than public safety?
Chicago back in 2021 had a program where they stopped guns.
Do you
from
think
going-
people would spend more money if they were less likely to get
hold
shot?
on a second.
You think that's
Joe,
fair?
hold on a second. You asked him a question. Let him answer
The
your
majority
question.
of illegal guns in Chicago, I live there, come across state lines from Indiana. So there are ways to minimize crime and minimize shootings.
How's that
it's by
working?
having federal troops, or not federal troops, federal agents launch investigations over state lines. Sending troops is a temporary, expensive, and not a good long-term solution.
Do you
Ellie,
think that
let me
less
ask
people
Ellie
would go out to
this.
dinner more if they were
Hold
less
on,
likely to
Joe.
get shot?
Ellie, Trump just today, shortly after this ruling, then turns around and deploys 350 National Guard members to New Orleans.
Right.
What happens now?
Well, so I think he's found a sort of way to thread the needle here, right? If you are invited in by a governor, Louisiana has a Republican governor, then you can send in the troops, right? So that is a way to work around this. What he's not going to be able to do is send troops, for the most part, given this ruling, into states that have Democratic governors. So any plans for Portland, Oregon, for New York, for
and to
Illinois?
use troops from other states, because one of the things
Right.
they were trying to do was to Texas troops, send them
But-
to
well,
Illinois.
And there's
that
also,
type of thing.
really importantly, there's always that restriction, though, all right, except for in the direst of emergencies. This is Posse Comitatus, to use the, I guess, Latin phrase, that military troops cannot perform civilian law enforcement functions. There's a strict wall there between those two functions.
Well, and there's a question as to whether or not they were being directed
That was in
to
dispute.
perform
Yep.
a civilian law enforcement function if they're protecting federal agents that is not per se, ipso facto, a civilian law enforcement activity. I think that wasn't ruled on either, Ellie, was it?
That was not in this, right?
Okay, but they won't be sending troops into Republican states because that would mean you would have to acknowledge what?
They
That it's
are.
crime.
There is crime. In New Orleans, there's a crime problem. Governor Leahy's still
but that's just
open
because
about
of
it.
the city. What I'm saying
Governor
is,
Hochul was open about it. Here, she put the National Guard on subways, and it worked well. It was
what
a
I'm
highlight
saying
of her
is, Joe,
administration.
what I'm saying is, Joe, you guys have been saying, what about Chicago? What about Chicago? What about Chicago? And it failed. You guys lost. You lost the Illinois argument.
Did it work in New York?
You lost the say it with me. You lost
the case in Illinois.
That's it. That's
The
all I want you to say.
victims are the people
because
who
you guys
lose,
have been
though.
writing.
There's
No,
600
you're right.
people who were
You're right. And the
Ellie
answer question, there
2,000
are
people who
protests
were
about
shot.
people who are getting
Thank you for having me,
Ellie
Abby.
Koenig, our legal sage. Thank you very much for being
Appreciate
here. Next for us.
So there are a couple of important points worth unpacking here, especially after Abby Phillip notes that the Supreme Court doesn't always rule in Donald Trump's favor. My view is that this current Supreme Court, which is overwhelmingly conservative, tends to operate with one primary priority in mind: protecting large corporations and big business interests. When cases directly affect corporate power, deregulation, or profits, that's usually where you see the court move quickly and decisively. What's interesting is that issues like ICE operations and the deployment of National Guard troops into major cities don't clearly benefit big business at all. In fact, aggressive deportation policies can actually disrupt industries that rely on immigrant labor, including agriculture, construction, and service work. So when those cases come up, suddenly you see the court acting a bit more restrained and more willing to stick closely to existing law. That contrast tells you a lot about what really drives decision-making at the highest levels. On the claims of widespread violence against ICE agents, the reality, again, doesn't line up with the rhetoric. One specific incident was raised involving a woman allegedly ramming an ICE vehicle, but reports indicate she was a U.S. citizen who claims her car was struck first. That's very different from the picture being painted of coordinated mass violence. Meanwhile, we've seen National Guard members deployed in cities spending time on routine civic tasks like traffic support and cleanup. If cities were truly overwhelmed by violent unrest, that simply wouldn't be possible. What stands out most in this exchange is Adam Mockler's role. Adam actually lives in Chicago and is speaking from lived experience about what conditions are like on the ground. He's not claiming to be the ultimate authority on crime, but he is pushing back on exaggerated narratives with firsthand context. And this is where a familiar pattern shows up. Even when someone has direct knowledge or credible experience, the MAGA response is often to dismiss it as just an opinion if it doesn't fit the preferred narrative. That dynamic matters because democracy depends on reality-based debate. You don't have to agree with Adam Mockler to recognize that dismissing lived experience and evidence outright isn't how serious governing works. These conversations aren't about winning talking points, they're about whether policy is grounded in facts or fear. So what do you think? Do you agree with Adam Mockler's assessment here? Or do you think the concerns raised by the MAGA panelists hold more weight? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. I'm Mike, and I'll see you in the next video.